In November, we often focus on the year that awaits, the new year coming up, and we do so with an emphasis on our commitments, recognizing that some of us, myself included, need several weeks, even months, to sort of work up to new commitments and start making preparations for those. And so in the month of November, we've been talking about various commitments that we might make in the new year, commitments of our time, commitments of our talents. Next week, we'll talk about our Thanksgiving as we move into the Thanksgiving season. And today, as is usually the case during our commitment series, we want to pause and talk about our financial commitments as well, or the way that the Old Testament teaches this lesson, our tithes. Now, if you recall, the first few times that we studied tithing together, it was in the midst of and right on the heels of what is often referred to now as the Great Recession. And so it was with a little bit of trepidation that we would talk about that, recognizing the difficulty of trying to move toward a tithe in a season when many of us were already struggling with our financial commitments. You might remember that period, 2009, 2010, when many of us had made financial commitments based on income that was pre-2008. And we're just trying to manage to get through and get beyond that difficulty. In hindsight, perhaps you would agree with the statement, tithing is hard, generosity is easy. Tithing is hard, generosity is easy. Here's what I mean. The tithe is an idea. It's a premise. It's a spiritual discipline that the Old Testament is teaching. And if we can learn to embrace the spiritual discipline, we'll find that it only wants to grow within us. In other words, if we can get beyond that sort of inner resistance that will often bristle up within me, it's mine. I don't want to give it away. I don't want to give it back to the Lord. I don't want to accept the fact that it originated from God. Once I can get over that internal resistance, I begin to discover that the tithe is just the beginning. It's something that will grow and grow and grow. This desire to give, this desire to bless out of the abundance, out of the overflow of God's riches that have been bestowed within my life. In that regard, generosity is easy. It takes on a life of its own. Really, herein lies the same spiritual principle as is found within the Sabbath. This idea that by dedicating a little bit back to God, a little bit of time, a little bit of finance, a little bit of some other resource, then I will soon begin to see God, not just in the little bit, the 7th or the 10th, but in all of what God has given to me. In the beginning, I might say to God, Lord, I owe you one day, or I owe you 10%. But pretty soon it becomes, it's all yours, Jesus, and it was never mine to begin with. But sometimes that transition is difficult. From the challenge of a tithe to the ease of generosity. And sometimes, in general terms, any faith breakthrough is hard. And so in that recognition, I want to share and reflect a little bit upon another aspect of the story that we've been celebrating all through November. And that is, we find ourselves 30 years past that great event in the life of our church when GBC chose to start ordaining women as deacons. And we've heard a couple of different aspects of that story. 3 weeks ago, we heard the story of leading up to 1989, all of the wonderful roles that women played in the life of this church. Last week, Pastor Heather shared with us stories from 1988 and 1989, leading right up to that moment when the church started to ordain women. But today, I want to back up and study a little bit of those years in between. Those years, those last several years leading up to that season in which it became clear in the life of this church that we were going to ordain women. Because I believe that there's some lessons that can be applied. We might be wondering today, how in the world am I going to learn to tithe, much less to learn to give with a generous heart? And if our GBC elders are any example, we will learn patiently and through repetition. Maybe we could learn then from some of the phrases that were uttered in the life of this church in the 5 years that led up to the decision to ordain women as deacons. For example, one phrase that was heard a number of times in those 5 years was the phrase, "I wouldn't know where to begin." What do you mean, ordain women as deacons? I wouldn't know where to begin in that idea, in that pursuit. How would we even start with this idea? And one of the reasons that those phrases were uttered is because back then we stumbled out of the gate. I'm told, and our minutes record, and our history book, that in 1984, 83 and 84, when we first took up the idea, it didn't go anywhere. And it was divisive. And the vote that came before the church failed. The congregation said, no, we are not interested in ordaining women as deacons at this time. And so the conversation started small, out of necessity, and led into 4 years of informal, behind-the-scenes conversation about the role of women. Now, we might learn from that phrase in the importance of conversation within the home. Prayerful, kitchen table, household conversation about how we use our finances. Now you might be thinking, well, we had that conversation. We had that conversation when our household came together, when we became roommates, when we got married, when we did these things. We had that conversation, some 18 months to 6 decades ago. It might be possible that from time to time we have that conversation again. One way that's been suggested of how a new household might move toward the idea of a tithe and beyond to generosity is to start with 1 day's wage. Right, if you're already set into financial commitments that have you swamped, think if you were to set the goal for your household of giving 1 day's wage of your income. There's even online resources. One calculator is found at onedayswages.org. And you can enter in your annual income. If it's $30,000 a year, for example, 1 day's wage is about $119, which comes out to about $10 a month. And I know, for example, that some months you might not have $10. You might have $7. Other months you might have $11. But now you're giving and starting small, much in the same way that our congregation started small in congregational conversation about the role of women some 35 years ago. Another phrase that was overheard back then is the phrase, "I just don't think we're ready." Not today. I'm not saying never. I'm just saying not now. I just don't think we're ready. Back then, that statement was tied to the reality that there was just so much sense of tradition. Already this congregation was some 170 years old. I just don't know. We've always had these traditions. We've always had this sense of orthodoxy and what that looks like. Underlying such statements is the reality. It's hard to admit that the faith community that you're in, or the faith community where you grew up, this church or a sister church back home someplace, has been choosing to ignore clear biblical teaching about the role of women. Right? It's been a long time since the Bible changed. It's been a long time. It's difficult for faith communities to come to the realization we've been choosing only one set of scriptures and have willfully been choosing not to read or follow an entire other set of scriptures that are right here in the text, plain as the nose on my face. That's a hard reality to come to. And nobody wants to say that out loud. It's hard to admit you've never heard the story of Deborah read in church. It's never been in a Sunday school lesson. It's never been in a sermon. You've never read Judges 4 and 5. It's hard to admit that you're not familiar with the story from today's passage in Luke chapter 8. You mean it was godly women who were bankrolling the Jesus movement? You mean it was the sacrificial generosity of these ladies? All of them sort of lumped together by the description that they had something in their past from which they'd been set free. It was their financing that made it possible for the disciples and Jesus to go wherever He led them. It's hard to say, I never noticed the story of Lydia in Acts chapter 16 and never thought about the fact that she's a church planter. She's planting a church in her home. It's hard to come to terms with the reality that you've glossed right over Galatians 3:28. In Christ there is neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female. Those are challenging conversations, and they were for us then. Now, we might use that phrase, I just don't think we're ready, when we talk about working up to a tithe. Because after all, if you haven't been giving, the idea of giving 10% to God is extremely intimidating. Maybe your next step, if you've started giving one day's wage a year, is to work up to 10% of something. 10% of something you decide, because frankly the Bible doesn't get into the 2019-2020 IRS tax code. Right? We're left up to some conversation with God, some prayerfulness within our hearts, and some of that kitchen table conversation we talked about a moment ago to work all of this out. Is your 10% gift before taxes, after taxes? I don't believe for a moment that the Bible is telling you to make a decision between your medical expenses and 10%, between your prescriptions and your 10%. But for starters, maybe it means that when you have that kitchen table conversation, you actually pull out the checkbook and pull out financial statements, pull out credit card bills, and look at your last 6 months. Really, if you want to get serious about this, you need to go back 18 months. And look at what's left over at the end of every month. And if there's nothing left over, and if you're in the hole every month, then there's a whole other set of conversations, and the church can help have those conversations with you. But whatever's left over, assuming that there is a little bit left over, take 10% of that average and then put it first the next month. And that's a tithe. That's the principle of the tithe. Maybe that's not the tithe you'll give in 10 years. Maybe that's not the tithe you'll give in 5 years. But it's learning and applying the principle of the way of life that Jesus lived and to which He calls us to live. Or maybe you've already made major financial commitments that will impact you, shackle you, for the next several years. Then set a target date. 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 2.5 years from now, and start giving this percentage at that time. Work up to it. Some have been giving what you can when you can, right? This is an age-old, tried-and-true method, particularly back when economies were mostly local. You would get your paycheck at the end of the week or the end of the month from the mill or the farm or wherever it was that you worked. You would go to town, you would go to the bank. You would often be able to pay on your mortgage right there at the counter. You would cash out whatever was left over, put it in your pocket, go down the street doing your grocery shopping, whatever else needed to be done. And when you came to church on Sunday, you gave what was left, or 10% of it. It's more difficult now, and most of us, our largest financial commitments are to towers in other cities, places we'll never visit with people we'll never know. But maybe you could do the math of what you have been giving and figure out the percentage of your household income. And if that comes out for you that you've been giving 0.7%, then maybe the goal for you is to give 1%. And a little while down the road, maybe you're not. going to be able to give 5%, or eventually you'll be able to give maybe not 10%, but eventually giving 6%, then you'll tithe your tax return. You're unable to give 10%, you can tithe your Christmas bonus. You're unable to give 10%, but you're able to tithe your overtime pay. Maybe this is the year you give a true classic, old-fashioned, Old Testament tithe of 10% of your annual household income. This year, 10% of your net income. Someday, 10% of your gross income. That's for you to work out with your household and the Lord. Another phrase that was overheard in the life of this church some 35, 34, 33 years ago, I've never seen this before. What are you talking about? I've never even heard of a church that ordains women as deacons. Cousins to that statement, variations are things like, well, we've never done it this way before, and nobody told me. Those are words and phrases that get used in a lot of settings, aren't they? Back then, they were used to talk about the implications for the role of women and men in the life of this church. And we had one dear saint who we've quoted so many times before, Miss Jane Hope, who said, you mean the women are going to have to be deacons? We've already done everything else. Now we have to do this too? So it doesn't always seem like a good thing to everybody. That was then, but now some of us have never learned to involve our household finances in our faith. Nobody ever told us that the Lord expected us to give every aspect of our being. When I was a little boy, one of the first gifts that I remember receiving from my parents was my Snoopy piggy bank. I guess it's not a piggy bank if it's Snoopy on top. It's my Snoopy bank. And I was taught a very simple investment strategy. No, I wasn't. This was well before I learned anything about investment. 10%, really 20%. Alan, when you get your allowance, and I couldn't even venture a guess how tiny my allowance was in 1981, 82, when I was presented with my Snoopy bank. Give 10% to Snoopy for savings and 10% to the church. And some of us grew up with a Snoopy bank or some equivalent. Others did not. And that's the point of emphasis that I want to share with you today. If nobody gave you a Snoopy bank, don't hang your head about that. You know, I didn't give my girls a Snoopy bank. But when my oldest daughter was born, Miss Lydia did. Lydia McDonald, been on the county committee for a long, long time. There's a plaque in memory of Pete hanging out in the hub because he was our treasurer for, some 32 years. I forget the number on that plaque. And she wanted to bless the still fairly new pastor's firstborn in a way that spoke to their role in the life of the church. And so she gave this piggy bank to my daughter, and she uses it. I guess I should dig Snoopy out and shake him. I use Snoopy too. And so that's the kind of teaching that sometimes happens in the life of the church. And by the way, if you're not aware, Miss Sandra and Mr. Darrell and the nursery gang upstairs pass out change to the kids in the nursery every Sunday, and then invite the kids to pass the hat and have an opportunity to give God's money to God. Right? It doesn't matter if you had a Snoopy bank or if somebody gave you a piggy bank or if you're just learning these principles of generosity today. Anyone can learn to live in the generosity that God desires for us. See, in the New Testament, we learn that the tithe is just the beginning. The tithe is frankly the tool for us to learn this spiritual discipline that has broad application in our lives to follow. These women in Luke chapter 8 are far more than tithers. These are people giving an abundance. These are people who are believing that God will provide, will supply, and they are giving and giving and giving some more. I truly believe this. I've told you before, I would not say this to you if I did not believe it. that a gift to the GBC General Fund is the closest to this kind of giving, this Luke chapter 8 kind of giving of any type of gift I know. Because any other place I know of where you were to give a gift would only give to some small area that is represented in the life of our general fund, in the life of our budget. So, for example, where else can you accomplish all of these ministries simultaneously? Supporting missionaries at home and abroad, supporting church planting efforts all around the world, supporting local benevolence needs, world hunger, caring for the most vulnerable in our congregation, whether it's seniors or those who are in medical need, or the next generation of folks who are being raised up in the life of the church, some of whom we'll dedicate to the Lord at the 11 o'clock service today. Where else, in addition to all of these things, can you also support readiness for disaster response, local missions education, discipleship, fellowship, worship, and the transformative embrace of our ministry context here in Georgetown and Scott County? To what other organization can you give who even attempts to meet such a variety of needs? There's another phrase that showed up around here years ago. I guess I just see it differently. I guess I just see it differently. Which is one part of the legacy of this congregation that I love most dearly. We strive our hardest not to draw artificial, arbitrary lines in the sand beyond which point there are winners and losers, and winner takes all. And part of the story of that 5-year conversation and beyond in the life of this church was creating ways for people to have dignity when they disagree. Godly, prayerful, tradition-based reasons that they disagree. We've done this again and again and again. And so back then, in addition to the informal conversation, in addition to the conversation within the Constitution and Bylaws Committee, there was, we did what good God-fearing Baptists do. Did we pray about it? I don't know. Did we talk about it? Apparently. But what I know we did was form another special committee by God. And that special committee went off and considered it further and came back and brought a recommendation. And therein is one of the places that we saw the role and the leadership of our first female deacon really and truly begin to shine. Pastor Heather talked last week about the role of Mary Beth Hambrick, working so faithfully in all of these processes toward what eventually took place. But what also happened is that Mary Beth worked with that special committee. And she then, in turn, was set aside for special purpose. She was set aside to be ordained as the first female deacon in the life of this church. And I'll just tell you, we want to bless her. One of our current deacons, Terry Sutton, our church clerk, pulled so much of this research together and made it available for the pastors to use. And in that research, you can really see the story of Mary Beth. And so next Sunday, we're going to honor Mary Beth. As part of the culmination of our month-long celebration, we're going to honor Mary Beth. Now, it's just not feasible for her to come to us for a full Sunday morning. We're not going to ask that of her. But next Sunday afternoon, we're going to have a little gathering in her honor at Windsor Gardens. We're going to go to her. Now, it would overwhelm her for the entire congregation to go, but there's a couple of ways that we can participate. One, some of us are going to go in person. And the only fair way that I can think of to do this is that we will ask folks sort of first come, first serve. If you're interested in going to bless Mary Beth, send a text or call the pastoral care phone and let us know that you're interested. We're going to consult with the staff at Windsor Gardens to figure out the number to cap that at. Please don't be hurt if you're not able to go. We don't want to overwhelm Mary Beth on the numbers of our visit. But the second way that all of us can participate is right over here on top of the baptistry. You can write a little note, drop it in the basket over here today or sometime during the week or next Sunday, and we will deliver all those to her along with a lovely floral arrangement as we go to honor and bless Mary Beth. Now, that was the conversation then, but now, as we talk about differences, Be not alarmed, be not dismayed, because generosity comes in many forms. Right? The Bible talks about a number of different ways that we might express generosity. For some, generosity is the tithe. We see it described in Deuteronomy chapter 12 and a bunch of other places in the Old Testament, where you can bring all your treasure, whatever your particular financial base is. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible makes it clear it is welcome to the Lord. Some folks will give alms. In fact, in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus assumes when you give alms, he says. Just as soon as he says when you pray, he says when you give alms. He assumes that as we come before the Lord in worship, we will do so in a spirit of generosity. Some of us operate on a fixed income. Actually, I would argue that all of us operate under a fixed income. But Luke chapter 21 is that time-treasured story of the widow who gave all that she had. And that's generosity. Still others have had incredible wealth bestowed upon them. And Jesus talks about ministry of those who are wealthy in Matthew chapter 19 and in Luke chapter 19. And we see in Luke 19 in the story of Zacchaeus, someone who does all that he can to serve out of the abundance of his wealth. There are folks in the life of this church whose investment and retirement portfolios now number in the hundreds of thousands and even in the millions of dollars. And it is not structured in any formal sense to give to the Lord. While you're still living, those who are living with such wealth might become persons who culture and society would describe as philanthropists. And if we were to structure our legacy estates, then after you're gone, you could be known as someone who gave a legacy gift. How many times was this church able to go to the Osborne Fund to build and to renovate and to put in an elevator and again and again and again? And how many times today are we going back to the White and Weldon estates to be able to make improvements for safety purposes to the life of this facility? And some are most passionate about going back to that earliest story of the earliest church in Jerusalem, in Acts chapter 2, and see the story of those who shared everything they had in common within the life of the church. And you want to go above and beyond a tithe, perhaps by giving to the Family Assistance Fund, which is this beautiful double-blind process so that you don't know who's giving and you don't know who's receiving, but people in the life of the church who have hit a hardship period are able to be blessed financially. It's out of the overflow of that type of ministry that people start to come to the spiritual leaders of the church, start to pull the pastors aside, start to pull the deacon officers aside and say, I have the means to do a little more. I want to give a gift. What does the church need? This morning we've talked about a lot of different ways that you might give, a lot of different models that are laid out in Scripture, and a lot of history from our past and a lot of heritage for our future. We're doing so within the context of reflection about our commitments, time, talents, thanksgiving, and today to embrace Christ's call to generosity as it is exemplified by these godly women in Luke chapter 8 who made it possible for Jesus and the disciples to minister wherever and whenever they were needed. Perhaps for you, this sparks something deep within, a desire to move towards a tithe or to move towards generosity, however it is defined for you prayerfully and in conversation at your kitchen table. This morning we want to give you an opportunity to respond. For some it may mean perhaps a tithe or perhaps a tithe aside. You know that you need to grow in the Lord today, perhaps through a first-time commitment. If you're ready today to receive Jesus as Savior and Lord, then come as we sing, make that decision known. Or for others to take a next step forward, to commit some aspect of your being, your finances, your professional life, some aspect of your being that you've held back from God, and you realize today it all needs to come before the one from whom it originated in the first place. Others may be recognizing it's time to come formally into the life of this church. We would love to receive you. And still others may need a time of prayer, a time of reflection in your lives. However it is that you need to respond to the work of the Holy One moving in your life today, we stand and we sing in hopes that you'll come.